Hi everyone, I painted some grapes for PrimeArt, which is part of the Watercolour Month. The paper that they supplied was the Fabriano Artistico, just a beautiful cream color. It's traditional white, but it's not a white paper. You do get a very white paper for Fabriano. And my voice is deciding to go away because I have been doing quite a lot of voiceovers recently. But anyway, this block is glued on 4 sides, and then there's a tiny corner opening on I think it's on the right at the top there. So this is going to be the paper that I will be using. I wasn't going to record the whole process, but then I decided, let me record the whole process so that I can share it either on Patreon and a small version or a shorter version on YouTube. But what I did was I just mapped it on the paper. For the grapes, I used mostly Daniel Smith watercolors, but you can find all of these colors with Winsor Newton, Core watercolors, the Mission watercolors. You can find it with all different brands. So just use similar colors, but you don't have to use only Daniel Smith watercolors. And the brush I use is the Kum Memory brush, point brush number 5. And then I use a lot of alizarin crimson. Now this alizarin crimson is exactly the same color or pigment, very similar to other brands. And then I use the quinacridone coral, and I always use the quinacridone coral at the bottom of my painting. I find that it just brighten up your grapes or flowers. I used it with the hibiscus flower as well, and I also used it with the Phalaenopsis orchid. And I prefer to use transparent watercolors, and it just helps to build the layers. I like to layer a lot of my paintings with lots of layers of watercolor paint, but it's all transparent. I'm obviously very careful because you don't want to create muddy colors. So what I do is I wait for each layer to dry completely before I start with the next layer. That's very important when you build colors like that. If you paint with transparent watercolors, you're going to add quite a lot of layers, so just make sure that you wait for each layer to dry completely before you add the next layer. This was the hibiscus flower that I painted, and as you can see, all those tiny little holes, that was what was caused by the slugs and the snails in my garden. They ate the flower. This is a full step-by-step tutorial on Patreon if you would like to join us there. Also, I painted the Phalaenopsis orchids very recently, and that is also the longest tutorial that I've ever recorded, and it is a full 2 or 3 petals. I will also link it here so that you can see it, and then maybe you would like to join us on Patreon to paint some of those flowers. During most of these videos, I will share the colors I use while I paint, and then for Patreon I have a full list of supplies. Now here is where I add all of the brownish sections on the grapes. Some parts have turned a little bit more brown. This bunch of grapes had the most beautiful colors, all bright pinks and purples and nothing black yet. They're about to turn because it's like a tiny little black grape. But these colors were all like pinks and greens, and they couldn't make up their mind. They were like yellow, they were blue, there was a whole bunch of colors, and it was just the most amazing bunch of grapes, and that's why I took a photo of it so I can paint it for this tutorial. And now here I'm starting to create a lot of texture on this grape. Now this is the most important grape on this whole bunch of grapes. I feel for me it was the one that stood out. This is the one where there was a lot of reflection from light and a lot of detail. So, and also one thing before I forget, always when I'm finished with my painting I always cover it with a sheet of that wax type of paper. It is a tracing paper that you can buy from any art store, and you can use it to cover your paintings. It's very important because I've messed on my paintings before. I leave it open, but we also have Wobbles, which is a tiny little wagtail, a little birdie that comes into the house, and she loves to sit on my art table, and then you can just imagine what happens there. Yes, she always mess on my paintings. I always have to clean it there, so I try to clean it all. But for that part of the grape, I always make sure that I have one that stands out. For the flowers too, I always have one that stands out a lot more than the others. Then I go back and I just soften some of those lines, and I also make sure that the lines are very nice and straight, because as you paint you do tend to go over some of the lines, but just use a little scrubber brush and just go over it and just neaten it up all the time so they stay a little bit more neater. Now again, one thing that you want to do when you are a beginner or you're new to watercolors, you would preferably wait for each section to dry, like I mentioned in the beginning, because for me, I paint quite a lot of layers of watercolor. So what I do is I move on to the next section. I rather finish a little bit there, I add a little bit more paint there, and then I move on to the one that I painted, so that I can go back and all of those little markings on that grape that I painted with all of the light and reflection on, I want to make sure that that pigment soaked into the paper completely before I go back and paint over it, because if you now go over it immediately after you painted it, you will lose all of those beautiful lines and textured little markings that you're painting. So I'm just going to make sure that each section is dried completely, and also if you use opaque watercolors, just make sure that you water it down if you want to achieve the same result, well, similar result. You won't get exactly the same result, but you will get a similar result. And what I'm going to do now is I want to darken certain sections where there's a shadow, where some of the grapes fall on top of the other grapes, or the shadow fall on top of the other grapes, and they sort of touch each other. For that, I just mix in a little bit of that black that I have, or you can just use some of your ultramarine. You can also use a drop of a neutral color, and for this I used a little bit of the Soda Light Genuine, and then it's also a neutral tint that I use from Daniel Smith, just to darken it slightly if I didn't get to a dark enough color with the blue. Also the blue will maybe turn too blue, and I don't necessarily want that. You can mix a little bit of the alizarin crimson mix with the blue to create a purple, and then mix that in there to create a darker little shadow mix. But it's all up to you what you want and how you want your painting to look in the end. For this, I'm just going to soften the lines, and then I make sure that I clean my water all the time. So for this, I have to be careful, because I can easily create very muddy watercolors here because of all of the colors that I use. So I make sure that I change my water. I must have changed it about 10 times really, because it was muddy. So I always make sure I have 2 glasses of clean water, and then the one always tends to get dirtier, where I rinse my brush for the first time in the dirty glass. It's not really dirty but full of pigment, and then I rinse it if I have to change colors, for instance to yellow. I make sure I rinse it in the clean glass of water. That way I don't create muddy colors. I also make sure that if I do use my scrubber brush, that I use something just to smooth the paper once the paper is completely dry, because it also lifts the paper and it makes it slightly woody. So just make sure that when you do scrub on your paper, you take something to smooth it out, something that is soft, that will just smooth off the paper. And for this is where I'm going to use the brown marks, and again, like I said before, I'm just mixing the colors, moving it around, softening the colors, but I also make sure that I slowly start to use thicker consistency of colors. I use a lot less water for my painting right now. Even though certain sections still very watery, I'm starting to build up on the colors and the detail, and I want it to look a little bit more, what I'd say, flat on the paper, but 2D to 3D. Another thing I forgot to mention is I always have tissue paper handy, especially for my style of painting. I normally just have the paper on the right hand side there, or on the left hand side. As you can see, I swiped my brush there a few times as well. But I always just make sure I have a lot of tissue paper, or if you want to use a cloth, that's fine too, that I can wipe my brush on. You also want to make sure every time you rinse your brush, say for instance I was working with this red or blue now, that when I do rinse my brush, I wipe it on the paper to make sure that all the pigment is rinsed out of the brush. Because sometimes you will see you'll have some paint on your brush left, and you're supposed to go onto something, maybe a part that's more yellow, and you will have some red mix in there, and then you have to remove it quickly. That way, if you do wipe your brush on a piece of tissue paper, it will not create that mess. The other thing I like to use for some parts of my grapes where it looks like there's bloom on my grapes, I normally use either a purple mix. So for instance, I will use alizarin crimson with ultramarine. I will also use some Payne's grey with a blue tinge to it on the edges of each of the grapes where it looks like it's rounded. That way also, for the blue, I prefer to use ultramarine mixed with a little bit of alizarin crimson. That way it creates this beautiful purple mix and it really looks like bloom. The other color that I really like to use in my paintings is the quinacridone red, quinacridone red mix. It's a beautiful peachy, pinky color, and it's just amazing the way it creates all of those. It shines through each layer that you're going to paint. Obviously, if you use transparent watercolors, you'll see that I've already layered it over certain parts of my grapes, and then when I go over it with a different color, I make sure that those layers are very watery because I do want to see that quinacridone red mix to shine through all of these colors. So test it out for yourself if you like it. And here's some part of the grapes that I've added, very watery layers. And then I just started building again, and now I'm adding in some of those brown parts. That was, I don't know what insect caused that, or was a slug. Some parts just have it naturally on the grapes, but anyway, it's there. So I like to map it or paint it in. I like to add detail on my paintings, and this is where I'm just starting to add in the brown, and the brown is mixed by colors that I have on my palette already. I didn't use the brown. So again, here I just use the tip of my brush, and do want a brush with a nice tip for these parts where I add all of these little details in. And if you look closely on my grapes right now, there's quite a lot of texture, but when you stand back and you look at the painting, you won't see all of those markings necessarily, but they will shine through each layer that we painted previously. And then I will go back later and just with a clean brush and a little scrubbing brush and just clean all of the edges that touch the white paper. That way I make sure that the painting comes together and it's all nice and clean. I also sometimes like to use a clean water layer for a wash or a glaze, but sometimes it will dilute all of your colors, so just be careful when you do that. I like to do that, but then I always go back over with another layer of some of my pigments just to brighten it up again. Now you can just see all of these little textures, especially at the bottom. I think it's also birds. Some of the birds, we had quite a lot of birds trying to get to all of the grapes, and well, it was fun. We had to cover these grapes with some nets. It was quite a mission, but somehow they even made a nest in some of the nets. They still got into the grapes. So no matter what you do, the birds will still find a way to get into that. Hope you enjoyed it, and if you want to paint a full step-by-step tutorial, it will be on Patreon, hopefully soon. I won't promise when, but we will be working on that. So here's the finished painting. I'm still going to add quite a lot of layers, but I will show you how the painting ended up. Just remember to have fun and enjoy the process. Watercolor is fun. Some paintings take much longer than other paintings. You can paint much looser and just drop in the paint. You don't have to add in all of the texture. If you don't want to miss any of our videos, press the bell button so that you will be reminded every time we load a new video. And here is the grapes. I think it turned out quite lovely. I like it. See you soon with a new video.